I received an invitation to my sister's wedding, but my husband wasn't invited, and now I understand why. I'm a 34-year-old woman married to my husband Ethan for around 5 years now. Our marriage has been great, and we've always stayed close with my family, especially my younger sister Angela, who's 30. Angela recently got engaged to her fiancé, and naturally we were excited for them. I always thought Ethan got along well enough with my family, nothing significant had ever stood out, but then something happened that completely threw me off, and I'm still trying to process it. A few weeks ago I received a wedding invitation from Angela. I was honestly thrilled. I had been really looking forward to her wedding, to celebrating with family, catching up with everyone, and just being there for her. The invitation itself was beautiful, one of those fancy cards with gold trim, the kind that immediately signals how formal the wedding will be. When I opened it, I expected to see both our names, but surprisingly it was just addressed to me. That felt strange, so I double-checked to make sure there wasn't an error, but it was indeed a solo invite addressed to me alone, with no mention of Ethan. At first I thought maybe it was just a simple mistake, or maybe a weird issue with the guest list. I didn't tell Ethan immediately because I didn't want to worry him if it was just a mix-up. Instead, I decided to quietly investigate. I called my dad, thinking he'd know what was going on. My dad and I are pretty close, so I assumed he'd be able to clear things up easily. But when I asked him about it, he hesitated, as if he was figuring out how to respond, and then he gave me a vague, almost half-baked explanation about Angela and Liam wanting a smaller guest list so they might not have space for plus ones. Something about his tone didn't feel right. It was too casual, almost as if he was trying to brush it off. It didn't sit well with me, but I let it go at the time, telling myself that maybe I was overthinking and could deal with it later. Looking back, I realize I should have trusted my gut, because later turned into a much bigger issue. Eventually, I had to tell Ethan about the invitation. I didn't want to hide it from him, and I figured he'd notice something was up if I avoided bringing it up. So I told him, and he took it harder than I had expected. He's always been very family-oriented, and we've attended every family event together since we got married. Not being invited to Angela's wedding felt personal to him, as if he'd been intentionally excluded, and I could see he was hurt, even though he tried to play it off. I kept reassuring him that it was likely a mistake and that I'd get to the bottom of it. However, the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I decided to text Angela in a casual way, saying something like, "Hey sis, I got your invite and wanted to check about Ethan's. Wasn't sure if his was separate or something. I didn't want to come across as confrontational, in case it truly was a mistake." But to my surprise, Angela didn't respond, which was strange since we talk all the time. A day or two passed without any reply, and I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling that had started to grow. I tried not to make a big deal out of it around Ethan, but I could tell something wasn't right. The following weekend, we had a family barbecue at my cousin's place. I figured I'd see Angela there and maybe get a chance to talk to her face to face. At the very least, I was hoping someone would bring up the wedding so I could get a better sense of what was happening. During the barbecue, I overheard my cousin talking to someone about Angela and Liam's strict guest list. I wasn't paying close attention until another person mentioned that everyone's significant others were invited except for Ethan. That's when I started to feel that gnawing sensation again. It wasn't just a mistake. They had deliberately left him out. Right then, I decided it was time to have a serious talk with my parents. If they knew what was going on, they were either covering it up or didn't think it was worth addressing. Later, I pulled them aside and asked them directly why Ethan wasn't invited. My dad tried to brush it off like it wasn't a big deal, but my mom avoided eye contact the entire time, saying things like, "It's just one day, and we don't want any drama before the wedding." That was when I realized there was more to the story, and they weren't being fully honest with me. That evening, Ethan asked me outright what was happening with the wedding invite. I didn't have the heart to lie, so I told him what I'd overheard at the barbecue and mentioned that Angela still hadn't responded. He was obviously hurt, but more than that, he felt singled out, as if he'd done something to warrant being excluded. I didn't have any answers for him, and the more I thought about it, the more I began to feel like I was missing something significant. Ethan wondered if it might be due to a minor disagreement he'd had with my mom a while back, but that seemed too trivial to cause this much tension. None of it made any sense, and the entire situation was starting to take a toll on both of us. I knew I had to confront Angela directly. This wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It felt like there was something bigger at play, and I needed answers before things escalated even further. Update 1, I decided to stop waiting and messaged Angela directly, asking if we could meet. I told her we needed to talk about the wedding and why Ethan wasn't invited. After a few hours without a response, she finally replied and agreed to meet later in the week. She mentioned she'd bring Liam along, which I didn't mind. I wanted to hear his side too. The meeting was set at a casual restaurant, and I informed Ethan, assuring him that I'd get to the bottom of it and fight for his inclusion. He looked worried but nodded, clearly hoping I could resolve things. He didn't want to come along, and I didn't press him to. When I arrived at the restaurant, Angela and Liam were already there, seated at a table in the corner. The atmosphere felt tense from the outset. Liam sat stiffly, arms crossed, while Angela looked uneasy, as if she didn't want to be there. There wasn't much small talk. We all understood the purpose of the meeting. Without wasting any time, I asked them directly why Ethan wasn't invited to the wedding, making it clear I wasn't interested in excuses or evasions. I wanted a straightforward answer. Angela shifted uneasily, but Liam spoke first, bluntly saying he wasn't comfortable with Ethan attending the wedding. His tone was almost rehearsed, as though he'd been preparing this for a while. Angela stayed silent, staring at the table. I was completely stunned. I expected an explanation about the guest list or maybe some misunderstanding, but this was different. I pressed him for details, and then he dropped the bombshell. According to Liam, Ethan had made comments at a family gathering last year, remarks about their relationship that deeply offended him. Liam claimed Ethan made sarcastic comments, suggesting he wasn't good enough for Angela. I was shocked. It didn't sound like something Ethan would say. I asked when this supposedly happened, and Liam pointed to a specific family barbecue. I tried to recall that day but couldn't remember anything inappropriate from Ethan. Everyone seemed to be getting along fine as far as I remembered. Yet Liam insisted the comments had stuck with him and that he didn't want any negativity or potential drama on his wedding day. I looked at Angela, hoping she'd step in, but she still hadn't said a word. That's when it hit me. Angela was supporting him in this. I asked her if she agreed with what Liam was saying. She finally responded, but it wasn't what I wanted to hear. Angela said that while she didn't fully agree with Liam's take, she needed to support him, especially for their wedding day, emphasizing that it was his day, as if that justified excluding my husband. It felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe my own sister was going along with this. It felt like a betrayal. I told them I thought they were blowing things out of proportion, that if Ethan had said something, it was likely a misunderstanding. But Liam wasn't budging. He insisted he didn't want to risk any tension at the wedding. Things got heated, and I felt my voice rising as I accused Liam of clinging to a petty grudge. Liam held his ground, and Angela just sat there, looking like she wanted to disappear. Then Liam mentioned something that really shocked me. He said other family members agreed with him, which is why no one was making a big deal about Ethan's absence on the guest list. I couldn't believe it. I had assumed this issue was just between him and Ethan, but now I learned that other family members were involved too. It made me feel like I didn't even know my own family anymore. I left the meeting more confused and conflicted than ever. Part of me wanted to defend Ethan no matter what, but another part of me wondered if he had somehow unknowingly offended Liam. I hated that I was even questioning it, but the doubt had taken root. When I got home, I told Ethan everything that happened. He was devastated, furious even. He insisted he had never said anything like what Liam was accusing him of. I believed him, but it didn't make things any easier. Now, this wasn't just about the wedding. Ethan felt he was being unfairly targeted by my family, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. In the days that followed, things were awkward with my family. No one brought up the wedding again, but the tension was palpable. Ethan started withdrawing even more, avoiding family gatherings and distancing himself from anything related to Angela or Liam. It was starting to strain our marriage as well. Ethan was upset that I hadn't stood up for him more forcefully, and I was stuck in the middle, unsure of how to proceed. I knew I couldn't keep stalling. The wedding was coming up soon, and I had to decide if I was going to attend without Ethan or stay by his side, even if it risked a family rift. It felt like I was being forced to choose between my husband and my family, and I didn't see a way to resolve it without losing something important. Update 2: the next few days were unbearable. I couldn't stop thinking about the wedding. On one hand, it was my sister's big day, and I had been looking forward to it for months, excited to celebrate with her and the family. But on the other hand, how could I go when Ethan was being left out like that? The thought of attending without him, knowing how hurt he was, just didn't sit right with me. I spent a lot of time weighing everything, but I knew I needed to talk it out with someone. So, I called my best friend Marie, who's great at seeing things clearly. We met for a drink, and I laid out the whole situation for her. Marie didn't hold back. She told me straight up that what Angela and Liam were doing was wrong. She was stunned that they'd deliberately exclude Ethan, and she advised that, in her opinion, I shouldn't even consider going. Skipping the wedding is the right move, she said. If you go without him, it'll mess with your marriage. She was right. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that attending without Ethan would imply I was okay with him being left out, which I wasn't. Not even close. Meanwhile, things at home were getting harder. Ethan was really struggling. One night I found him in the kitchen, quietly crying. He told me how hurt he felt, how he was starting to doubt whether I was truly on his side. He said it felt like he was being shut out of the family, and it was breaking him. That hit me deeply. I knew things were bad, but seeing him like that pushed me to make a decision. The following morning I sat down with Ethan and told him I had made my decision. I wouldn't attend the wedding if he wasn't invited. I said it plainly to make sure there was no doubt. Ethan looked relieved, but I could still see the pain in his eyes. This situation had already left its mark on him, and while he was glad I was supporting him, the fact that we were in this position at all hurt both of us. Afterward, I picked up the phone and called Angela. I told her outright that if Ethan wasn't invited, I wouldn't be coming to her wedding. Angela sounded taken aback, as if she hadn't expected me to make that choice. She began trying to convince me otherwise, saying I was overreacting and that I should just attend, even if Ethan couldn't. But I stood firm, explaining that I couldn't go to an event where my husband was intentionally excluded. No matter how much I wanted to be there for her, Ethan was my priority. The fallout from that conversation was immediate. My parents called, furious, accusing me of stirring up unnecessary drama and putting Ethan over family obligations. They argued I was being manipulated and blamed Ethan as the one causing problems. I was shocked at their anger. It seemed like they couldn't comprehend why I was standing by my husband. My parents have always been traditional, but I never expected them to turn on me like this. I told them the truth. Ethan wasn't the problem. The issue was that he was excluded for a petty reason. I tried to explain how much it hurt both of us, but they wouldn't listen, insisting I was overreacting and that family should always come first. Then Angela texted me. It was a long message filled with guilt-tripping language, claiming I was ruining her wedding by making this about Ethan. She said I should just go along with it for the day, that it wasn't a big deal. But that only made me angrier. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was about a bigger issue, standing up for my husband and our marriage. I wasn't going to back down just to keep the peace. Word quickly spread throughout the extended family. My uncle messaged me, saying he understood and supported my decision, but not everyone was as sympathetic. I got passive-aggressive messages from some cousins, calling me whipped by Ethan and accusing me of blowing things out of proportion. It seemed like the whole family was weighing in, and most of them didn't see it from my perspective. It was frustrating, but I tried not to let it get to me. Through all the chaos, Ethan was the one thing keeping me grounded. He told me how much my support meant to him, admitting he'd feared I might give in under family pressure. Knowing I wouldn't attend the wedding without him made him feel more secure in our relationship, a small comfort in an otherwise difficult situation. In the days leading up to the wedding, the tension was palpable. My parents and Angela stopped reaching out, clearly upset that I wouldn't change my stance. I felt increasingly isolated, but Ethan stood by me, reassuring me that we were doing the right thing. We spent a lot of time together just talking and trying to get through it. When the wedding day arrived, I won't lie, I felt guilty. I couldn't stop wondering what it would have been like if Ethan had been included. I knew people would notice my absence, and part of me felt sad that it had come to this. But I didn't regret my choice. The wedding happened without us, and afterward there were no updates from my family, just silence. But I knew that wouldn't last. The real fallout was yet to come, and I was bracing myself for the confrontation that was sure to follow. Update 3: the day after the wedding, I was barely awake when my phone rang. It was my dad. I had anticipated this call, but I still wasn't prepared for what came next. He skipped the small talk, his voice cold and sharp. "Are you happy with yourself?" That was how he began, and I already knew where this was going. I braced myself as he launched into a tirade, blaming me for ruining Angela's special day, saying that my absence was noticeable and people were asking about it. He made it seem like I had single-handedly tarnished the event. He was furious, implying that I had put Ethan above family and had torn everything apart. I asked him if he'd spoken to Angela and Liam about why Ethan hadn't been invited, hoping he'd finally understood. But he dismissed it, saying it wasn't a big deal. That really struck a nerve. I told him it was indeed a big deal to both Ethan and me, that it wasn't just about the wedding but about how my husband had been treated as an outsider for no justifiable reason. My words hung heavily in the silence that followed, but he didn't back down. Instead, he insisted I'd overreacted and ruined the day. Soon after, my mom called, and if I thought it couldn't get worse, I was wrong. Her tone wasn't angry, it was disappointed. She made it clear she believed I had let the family down by not attending, that I should have put the issue aside for Angela's sake. It stung. She talked about family obligations, but I couldn't understand how she expected me to leave Ethan out and act as if everything was fine. While I was on the phone with my mom, Ethan overheard part of the conversation. He'd been trying to stay out of it, but this was too much. He stepped in and told my parents exactly how he felt, saying they had treated him as an outsider from the start, and the wedding exclusion was the final straw. It was the first time he had addressed them directly about it. I stood by his side, finally seeing how deeply this had affected him. I told my parents the truth that they'd always treated Ethan with a subtle hostility and that the wedding snub made it obvious. I added that I wouldn't attend any more family events until they acknowledged their behavior. It was a boundary I never imagined I'd need, but there we were. Later that day, Angela reached out. She said she felt conflicted, claiming she hadn't expected excluding Ethan would create such a massive rift and didn't think I'd actually skip the wedding. I was floored. I told her it was unrealistic to expect me to leave my husband out of such a significant event and that I couldn't understand how she thought that would ever be okay. That was when Angela let slip something that changed everything. She mentioned, almost offhandedly, that it wasn't just Liam who had pushed to exclude Ethan. Our dad had also expressed concerns, saying he didn't want any potential drama at the wedding. I felt like the ground had fallen out from under me. Up until that moment, I thought this was only between Liam and Ethan, but now it turned out my own dad had played a part, going behind my back. I felt a betrayal that was hard to describe. I immediately called my dad to confront him. At first, he denied it, but when I pressed harder, he finally admitted that he and Liam had discussed it and decided it would be simpler if Ethan didn't attend. He tried to downplay it, saying they just wanted to avoid any tension. But for me, the issue was that he had schemed behind my back without even discussing it with me. That was the final straw. I told him directly that working with Liam to exclude Ethan was unforgivable, then ended the conversation, not wanting to hear any more excuses. The fallout from that conversation was immediate and sent shockwaves through the family. My mom tried to intervene, but I wasn't interested in talking unless they were ready to truly acknowledge how they'd treated Ethan. I wasn't going to keep brushing this aside just to maintain the peace. Ethan, meanwhile, felt both vindicated and heartbroken. He appreciated that I stood up for him, but the entire situation was painful. He had never wanted things to reach this point with my family, and I could see how much it weighed on him. It was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, we felt stronger together, but on the other, my family ties were quickly unraveling. Then came the fallout on social media. I began to notice some extended family members had unfriended or even blocked both Ethan and me. It was subtle at first, but before long it was clear the divide was growing. I wasn't sure if there was any chance of mending things at this point. After everything, Ethan and I decided to take a step back from my family for a while. We needed to focus on ourselves and our marriage to heal from the turmoil. We agreed that if my family couldn't treat Ethan with the respect he deserved, we'd move forward without them. It wasn't an easy choice, but it felt like the only way to truly move on from this mess. Update 4. After everything that happened, Ethan and I decided to go no contact with my family. We needed a break, some time to focus on ourselves, away from all the drama. For a few weeks, things were quiet. We spent time together, trying to heal from the hurt and tension. There were no calls, no texts from my parents or Angela, and honestly, the silence was a relief. Then, one evening out of the blue, I received a text from my dad. It wasn't long, just a few lines saying, "We need to talk. I'm ready to apologize." I was taken aback after weeks of silence. Here he was, reaching out with an apology. I showed the message to Ethan, and we both wondered the same thing. Was this genuine, or just an attempt to smooth things over without addressing the real issue? Despite my doubts, I agreed to meet him. I told Ethan I'd go alone, just to hear my dad out, but I wasn't about to let myself be guilted into anything. I was determined not to get drawn back into family drama unless there was a sincere change. We arranged to meet at a nearby coffee shop. I hadn't seen my dad since before the wedding, and I wasn't sure what to expect. When I arrived, the atmosphere was awkward from the start. My dad looked nervous, which wasn't like him at all. He skipped the small talk and went straight into what he called an apology, saying he was sorry for how things had turned out and claiming he never intended for Ethan or me to feel excluded. At first, I felt a glimmer of hope, but as he continued, I realized something was off. His apology was filled with statements: "I'm sorry if you felt hurt, and I didn't mean if you and Ethan thought we were leaving him out." It sounded conditional, as though he was downplaying the entire situation. The longer he talked, the more frustrated I became. I interrupted him to point out that his apology didn't feel genuine. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate choice to exclude Ethan, and it hurt both of us deeply. I told him that apologizing with all these ifs wasn't going to fix anything. My dad's face hardened at my words, and I could see his defenses coming up. He responded by saying he hadn't wanted any drama at the wedding, which set me off. I couldn't believe he still didn't understand the core issue. I told him that leaving Ethan out had caused far more drama than it could have ever prevented. The entire mess was a result of their choice to exclude Ethan without cause, and now the family was fractured because of it. My dad tried to justify his actions, saying that Ethan and Liam never really got along and he'd just been trying to avoid tension on Angela's big day. In his mind, it was all about keeping the peace, but that excuse didn't sit well with me. It was clear he hadn't considered how this would affect me or how excluding Ethan wasn't just about peace, it was about respect. As my frustration grew, he casually asked how Ethan had reacted to everything and suggested that maybe Ethan was being overly sensitive. That was the final straw for me. I snapped, telling him that Ethan had every reason to be hurt. He had been treated like an outsider for years, and now he was being pushed out of the family entirely. Of course he was upset, and I was tired of everyone acting as if it didn't matter. After my outburst, something shifted in my dad's demeanor. His tone softened, and I saw tears begin to well up. He said he hadn't realized how much his actions were affecting me and admitted he missed me, saying he wished things could go back to how they were. I didn't know what to believe. Part of me wondered if he was truly starting to understand, but another part of me was wary, thinking he might just be trying to win me back. I told him the truth, I missed my family too, but I wasn't willing to sacrifice my relationship with Ethan to pretend everything was fine. If he was serious about making things right, he needed to apologize sincerely to Ethan, not just offer vague excuses about avoiding drama. I told him plainly that until he made amends, Ethan and I would not be part of the family. My dad seemed reluctant, but he eventually agreed to apologize to Ethan, saying he would reach out, though I could see he wasn't fully convinced. His expression showed he still didn't completely grasp the extent of the hurt he'd caused. I left feeling a bit hopeful, but also wary. On one hand, I was glad my dad acknowledged some wrongdoing, but I wasn't certain if he'd actually follow through. I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt for now. When I got home, I explained everything to Ethan, who listened quietly, though I could tell he was just as skeptical. We agreed to wait and see what my dad's next move would be, but one thing was certain: we weren't going to fall back into old habits. If my family couldn't respect us both, we were prepared to move on without them. Update 5. A few days after meeting with my dad, his apology came through, though not in the way I had anticipated. He sent a carefully worded text to Ethan, just a few lines long, apologizing for any hurt caused and expressing hope that we could move forward as a family. When Ethan showed me the message, we both recognized what it was: an apology in name, but still impersonal, as if he was just ticking a box. There was no real acknowledgement of why this situation had hurt us so much. Ethan had mixed feelings. He appreciated that my dad had reached out, but it didn't address the deeper issues. He still felt like an outsider, and a text wasn't going to change that. I assured him that we would move forward on our own terms and wouldn't let a half-hearted apology close the matter. If they wanted us back, it would have to be on a foundation of respect. Meanwhile, word of what happened spread quickly through the extended family, and gossip was rampant. Some cousins reached out, suggesting I had overreacted by skipping Angela's wedding, saying I should have just gone for the sake of peace, even if Ethan wasn't invited. But I was done listening to those who didn't understand or care to understand the situation, and I wasn't going to let their opinions sway me. Then, unexpectedly, Angela contacted me, suggesting we meet for drinks, just the two of us. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I figured maybe she had taken some time to reflect. I agreed, hoping for the best while keeping my expectations low. When we sat down, Angela surprised me by starting with an apology for her part in the wedding conflict. She admitted she should have stood up for Ethan and me, but said she had been trying to avoid conflict with Liam. She seemed genuinely remorseful for how things had unfolded, and I appreciated her honesty. However, I couldn't ignore the damage done. I told her that, while her apology meant a lot, our relationship had been strained by this ordeal. I then asked about Liam, whether he planned to reach out to Ethan or at least acknowledge the harm he'd caused. Angela hesitated, then admitted that Liam still believed his decision to exclude Ethan was justified and felt no need to apologize. That was difficult to hear. Angela might have been ready to make amends, but it was clear that Liam wasn't willing to budge. He was holding on to whatever grudge he had, and there was no sign of that changing. That conversation made me realize something important. Even though Angela was remorseful, the root problem hadn't changed. Liam's attitude toward Ethan remained the same, and as long as that persisted, I wasn't sure if a full reconciliation was possible. I began questioning if I could even maintain a relationship with Angela while her husband continued to harbor this needless hostility. When I returned home, Ethan and I had a long conversation about whether we wanted to keep interacting with my family after everything that had happened. He was honest with me. He was open to giving them a chance, but only if they truly changed their behavior. He had no interest in being around people who didn't respect him, and I couldn't blame him. We had been through enough. That was when I realized I needed to make a tough choice. I couldn't keep seeking approval or hoping for peace from a family that wouldn't fully accept Ethan. We couldn't continue in this limbo, wondering if each family event would bring more drama. So Ethan and I agreed to set clear boundaries. We wouldn't attend any more family gatherings unless Ethan was invited and treated with respect. This wasn't about severing ties completely, it was about protecting ourselves and our marriage. We chose to limit our interactions with my family and focus on building a happier, healthier life together. I called my parents to inform them of our decision. Predictably, my dad was upset, accusing me of once again choosing Ethan over my family as though it were a betrayal. I stood firm, telling him that we wouldn't accept any further disrespect toward my husband. My mom was mostly silent, though I could sense she wasn't pleased. It was obvious that this decision had created a lasting division. My parents were hurt, and Angela seemed torn between loyalty to me and her relationship with Liam. I could tell that things would never go back to the way they had been. Despite all of this, I felt a new strength. This experience had brought Ethan and me closer together. We had endured so much, but in the end it had only solidified our commitment. We weren't just surviving the situation, we were emerging from it stronger. We decided to shift our focus to our future and leave the family drama behind us. We began planning a long talked-about vacation and even considered the idea of moving to a new city for a fresh start. It felt like the right time to look forward rather than stay stuck in the past. In the end, I came to an important realization: family is essential, but the most valuable family is the one you create with the person you love. I knew I had made the right choice in standing by Ethan, even if it meant leaving some people behind.